I think that worked. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. First and foremost, since you filled out the evaluations already, thank you so much for being part of this class. For those of you who've been 2 sessions, 1 session, whatever it happens to be, it's been a pleasure to learn with you. I think we've learned a lot from this class from my end. You know, if I schedule a Torah study class, I might have 5 people, 10 people. Apparently, if we study the New Testament, we fill them. So maybe I'm in the wrong business. I don't know. But it's been a pleasure learning with you. And by design, there have been 2 questions that I've still left on the table. Right? The 2 questions that we still have left on the table is his blood on our hands, which is the name of the class. And why do the Jews reject Jesus? And why did they? And that's the heart of the matter, right? And if I had answered it in the first session, you wouldn't have come back. So I've intentionally left it over to the 3rd session. But most importantly, it's been an honor learning with you. We have more classes coming up. I've got more sessions of different topics coming up. I hope to be able to continue our learning together. So in our first session, you'll remember that we focused on the time, the era in which the New Testament would have been written. And we talked about the influence first of the Greeks and then of the Romans in the area. We talked about the different sects, S-E-C-T-S, of Jews who existed at that time, and how because of the thumb of Rome, as well as the Hellenization, the assimilation into Greek thought and culture that took place in the era, in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago, how the time was ripe for something significant to happen. Right? We talked about how the thumb of Rome was pressed firmly down upon the Jews, and you had the assimilationist tendencies as well. Extreme poverty, hunger, thirst. It was a difficult time. People were seeking some sort of response. It was a time ripe for messianism. Some of you I had the blessing of learning with through a Fed Ed class where we talked about all the different false messiahs that have existed over time, and how really in nearly every generation in which things have been bad for the Jews, we've looked for a Messiah. We've looked for that spiritual figure who is going to lead us back to what was. Right? And of course, as we said on Tisha B'Av, that comes from the book of Eicha, from the book of Lamentations, as we sing each and every time we take out the Torah, Hashivenu elecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kikedem. Right? What is ultimately the Jewish dream? Renew our days today, just like the days of old. Right? Chadesh yameinu kikedem. Renew our days as the days of old, because that was when it was really good. When we had a holy temple, when the Jewish people were seemingly united, when we had a relationship with God, when we were in control of the land of Israel, can't you make today like it was then? And each and every generation, especially when a foreigner's thumb has been upon us, when times have been tough financially, when times have been tough spiritually, when times have been tough just with the amount of food in our belly, we're looking for redemption. We're looking for that messianic figure. That's exactly what took place 2,000 years ago. We had the response of the rabbis. We had the response of the zealots. We had the response of the Sadducees. We had the response of the Essenes, and we talked about those. And then ultimately we had the response of a group of people who ultimately called themselves Christians. And we talked that first session about the milieu that led to that. Then this last session, last week, we talked about the New Testament itself. What I prefer to call the Christian foundational writings. Right? Because when we call it, thank you, when we call it the New Testament, we're implying that there was an old one. And so we don't call it the New Testament, but rather the Christian foundational writings.
I like that.
It's not mine originally, I can't claim it. And so we looked this last time at the various Gospels, and we compared one to another. I don't know if anyone took the big packet home and looked at it. Were there any questions left over from last? You have to think about what happened yesterday, let alone last week, right? Are there any questions from the Gospels? We're going to sort of bring it all together, but if there were specific questions, I want to take them from the conversation last week.
It seemed to me that only one Gospel talked about the ascension of Christ, and I wonder what your thoughts were about that.
It's probably only because that's the one I put in there. all 4 Gospels talk about the ascension. So in a major way, the Gospels, as opposed to the rest of the books of the Christian foundational writings, the primary focus of the Gospels is actually on the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's their primary focus, right? Mark really doesn't spend a whole lot of time talking about the life, though he does spend some. He doesn't spend any time talking about the birth of Jesus. The other later Gospels will now incorporate a birth story, will incorporate more stories about Jesus' life. But by and large, they talk about the death, the crucifixion, what led to that, and the resurrection. And so it's an important place to probably start. And so thank you for bringing it up. Whose fault was the death and crucifixion of Jesus?
Judas.
It seems to be that blame for Jesus being captured is placed by the Christian foundational writings square on the shoulders of Judas. Right? I mean, all of us have learned just from being part of the Christian world that Judas is the one who betrayed Jesus. What did he betray him for?
30 pieces of silver.
30 pieces of silver. And how did he betray him?
With a kiss.
With a kiss. Right? How did the Romans know who to arrest? Judas went up and kissed Jesus. Right? So you've heard the expression betrayed by a kiss. That's where it comes from. For a measly 30 pieces of silver.
That's a U2 song.
A measly 30 pieces of silver?
No, U2.
Oh, betrayed by
a kiss.
Betrayed by a kiss.
Yeah.
U2 actually has a lot of Christian references in their music. So, what does Judas mean in Greek? Jew. Right? Jew. Judah, Judaism, they're all related. It's all the same word, Jew. Right? It's not a mistake, it's not a coincidence that when the formers, the people who formed Christianity, decided to name the person who is the, essentially the central antagonist of the Christian foundational writings, the enemy par excellence, if you will. Who did they name as the bad guys? The Jew. Right? They named it the Jew. Now, if we look to early Christianity, who was the primary people that they were trying to convert? The Jews. They wouldn't necessarily want to name a Jew as the bad guy if your goal is to convert the Jews. But if your goal is to get the Romans off your back, as early Christians were, if your goal is to get the Romans off your back, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? Who were the Romans hated the Christians? Who did the Romans hate more? The Jews. So now all of a sudden, it's very important to the early Christian writers to make sure everybody knows who the bad guy is. And who's the bad guy? The Jew. Betrayed for a measly 30 pieces of silver. So you want to know where the anti-Semitic idea of Jews being cheap and just in it for money comes from. That's where it comes from. Okay?
Where does it come from?
From the idea that Judas would sell out Jesus for a measly 30 pieces of silver. That it's all about money. It starts there. It doesn't end there, but it starts there. Right? Because ultimately we know what was the punishment that Jesus died from? Crucifixion. And I will tell you, you can and should read every word of Jewish scripture, whether Torah, Hebrew Bible, Mishnah, Talmud, whatever you want, and there's not one place in there where it lists crucifixion as a Jewish punishment. Crucifixion is a Roman punishment. Right? Crucifixion is a Roman punishment. So somehow the early Christians who didn't want Rome on their backs and who wanted to convert the Romans needed a way to say, no, Jesus wasn't really punished by the Romans. It's the Jews' fault. And as we know from the first session, we read the book of Matthew, and the book of Matthew very clearly says, right, that Jesus' blood is on our hands. Right? In the book of Matthew, written by, at best, Christian Jews, if not full-out Christians, right? they very clearly place blame for the crucifixion of Jesus at the hands of the Jews.
How long were the books written after he was crucified?
The book of Matthew would have been written at least a century after the crucifixion.
We have it to 300 years.
Okay.
The others were too.
Mark would have been a little earlier, a little less than a century, at least a generation, if not a couple generations. Matthew after that, Luke and John even more after that. Okay? So certainly a gap in time. So here we have the question, is his blood on our hands? Well, if you're a literalist and you take the book of Matthew as it were, then our ancestors said not only was the blood on their hands, but our ancestors for us said the responsibility continues. Now we're going to come to the heart of the question, which is his blood on our hands? And how do the Jews reject Jesus? And I just want to point out, if anyone wants, I'll leave these books out for a little while. These are from my personal library, but these are the books that I use to prepare the class. Modern Jews Engage the New Testament, written by my professor from the seminary, where I learned most of this and had to remember it. In Quest of Jesus, The World That Shaped the New Testament, Christian Faith and the Bible of Judaism, and finally, A Jewish Understanding of the New Testament.
Question.
Yeah.
How are you connecting Romans, crucifixion, and Jews?
Let's work backward. How did Jesus die?
Crucifixion. Which was a Roman custom.
Does anyone argue this?
No.
Anyone have a problem with it? Pretty much we can all agree on that. Historians pretty much agree that that was probably the case. Right? It says Jesus crucifixion Romans in terrible handwriting. That's what it says. How did Jesus get to the cross?
You had to walk 23 steps.
As it were.
That's what they did.
Well, we have a problem. Okay? If, let's say Judas sold him out. Okay? Let's even take the name off. Let's say someone sold him out and said that's the bad guy. What was the crime?
Say he was king of the Jews.
King of the Jews. So I'll ask the question again. What was the crime? Who cares if he says, I can walk around saying I'm king of the Jews too, no one's going to arrest me.
But he wasn't the king of the Jews.
He certainly wasn't wearing a crown until his crucifixion when they put a crown of thorns on his head. So what was his crime?
Wasn't he rallying up the Jews and against the government, and the government was afraid that they would be served by the sermons of Jesus and his followers?
Thank you very much. I like the sound of kids' voices. So his crime was insurrection against Rome. Right? He sought a revolution. He sought a revolution. So, does it make sense then that he was crucified? If he's rebelling against the Roman government, wouldn't it make sense that he received a Roman punishment?
In what way was he revolting against the Roman government?
Anyone have an idea in what way was he revolting against the Roman government? He wasn't really. There's no good answer to it other than what we read from the Gospels, right? He is trying to rally the Jews. The crime he gets punished for, that's what leads to crucifixion, is insurrection against Rome, trying to lead a revolt. But based on what we read from the Gospel writers, Jesus wasn't such a bad guy against the Romans. And so that brings us to the other end of the equation, which is Judas. And what do the Gospels tell us that Jesus' goal was? Merely to He wouldn't have used this word. To make the Jews do better, according to what his philosophy of Judaism was.
I thought Judas, by turning him in, he wanted to push the timeline faster. That's what my understanding was.
So there's another element to it. If the Christians believed Jesus needed to die in order for the next kingdom to happen, you would think they'd be thanking Judas.
That's what I was taught.
They're not thanking him, right? Or it's a double-edged, But here's where we have the problem, if you will. We know Jesus was crucified by the Romans. Fine. Crucifixion is a punishment for insurrection. Okay. Jesus called himself the King of the Jews, which could be implied as throw off the yoke of Rome and put Jesus in charge. But the Gospels don't dwell on that. Rather, the Gospels dwell on his mission toward the Jews, Jesus' mission toward the Jews, and that Judas is the bad guy. Okay? If you don't have this information, who's going to dislike the Christians the most?
Well, the Romans.
The Romans.
But there were no Christians then.
Right? Or who's going to dislike this Christian Jewish...
Jesus is God.
When the Gospels were written, there were Christians.
But this is prior to the Gospels. Jesus is still living.
I understand. But when the Gospels were written, there was a Christian community living in Rome. Right?
Okay.
Because ultimately, Jesus' followers failed to convert the Jews. Jesus' followers failed to convert the Jews. We didn't buy it. That's going to get to our second question.
Well, maybe I'll give it 2%.
At best.
Okay.
I mean, really at best. Probably closer to, 30 people. Right?
I mean, I'd be a little more than that.
Because what we see from history, and the Christians won't disagree with this, the bulk of the Christian community comes from the pagans. Paul, who was a follower of Jesus, realized that the Jews weren't buying it. The Jews weren't converting. So he said, phooey on the Jews, I'm going to go convert the pagans. That's who started converting to Christianity. That's where the Christian community comes from. And by and large, those pagans lived in Rome or in the Roman Empire. Okay? So if we take off this piece, right, ignore this piece, the Romans are the Christians' enemies. And during the time of the writing of the Gospels, Rome persecuted Christians like nobody's business. It was rough to be a Christian in early Rome. Okay? So if you are a Christian living in Rome, do you want the focus to be on how Jesus was an insurrectionist against Rome and how the Romans punished Jesus? No. You need a different story. So you shift the focus. The gospel writers shift the focus away from the Romans, who, to my eyes, clearly seem to blame for Jesus' death, and we got a new bad guy. Who do the Romans also hate? The Romans also hated the Jews. So all of a sudden now the Jews become responsible for Jesus' death.
The writers of the gospel, were they Jewish Christians, Nazareth? Are they considered that, or were they...
It depends who you ask. Right? We're already talking, though, Mark, who's the earliest gospel, was at least a generation after Jesus. He seems to be pretty familiar with the Hebrew Bible. There is a chance that he was Jewish, or ancestrally Jewish.
With whom did Judas make the pact?
With the Romans?
I believe it's the Sanhedrin, who then turn it over to the Romans. Okay? So,
And Pontius Pilate says, I mean, if that's a major aspect of insurrection against Rome, Pontius Pilate offers them Barabbas.
correct.
So
So Pontius Pilate looks better, and the Jews look even worse because of that.
Right.
But that's one of my favorite names. We talked about the first session. Pontius Pilate said to the Jews, "Do you want me to kill Jesus, or do you want me to kill Barabbas?" Okay, and the Jews say, "Kill that Jesus guy," right? Making the Jews look even worse. Well, what does the name Barabbas mean?
son of the father.
Son of his father. How many people do you know with the name Bar-Abba? Son of his father. It seems to me like John Doe. Okay.
Anthony Quinn played. I saw the movie.
Which name that blot out my name? Was that Jesus, the symbol or something?
The Yeshu?
Yeah.
Right, so that's what the Jews called him later, was Yeshu, Yamach Shemo V'zichrono, may his name be blotted out. At the time, he would have been either Jesus, which is a Greek name, or Yoshua, which is his Hebrew name.
Where's the blotted out reference? How does that come out?
The blotted out actually comes from the Torah, which talks about a tribe called Amalek, which is that's just where the expression "may his name be blotted out" comes from. And so anyone who becomes an enemy of the Jews, that's what they say about it. So hold on, I think we'll come back to it and you'll see it.
Does this Bar-Abba insinuate that he's the son of God?
No, he's a common criminal.
Okay.
Was he a revolutionary too?
Not Bar-Abbas.
Okay,
He was just a common, I don't remember if he was a thief or a murderer, one of those. So it comes down to this question of, is his blood on our hands? The gospel writers sure seem to work awfully hard to make it seem so. If you read with a historical eye, it seems pretty convincing that it's actually the Romans who are to blame. But let's give the benefit of the doubt, and let's say the Romans and the Jews were in collusion. Okay? I want to bring us to page 24, if you will. The handout that says why Jews reject Christianity. Does everybody have a copy?
I have one question
Yeah.
before you start. In the Bible, what you've done well goes for 4 generations, or what you've done well goes for many generations, what you've done bad passes down to 4 generations. Do you know that line?
Right.
Okay. So if this really is, and we really did whatever, it goes for 4 generations. I mean, nobody knows. We're not around. I don't.
Except for Matthew, the quotation in Matthew, right, which you have on the page 1 of the first day's syllabus,
Yeah.
said specifically, the Jews said, the blood is on our hands and future generations.
Forever.
Right.
So this is nothing that you can ever
Get rid of.
Right.
That's right.
And this makes sense to people.
So to speak, yeah. Because that's what their Bible says. Right? Our Bible says you should say Shema twice a day, and so we do. Their Bible says the Jews are to blame permanently for Jesus, and so they do. Until 1965. Right? And here we have the Second Vatican, which I've read about in the history books. And would someone mind reading where it says Second Vatican? Thank you, Neil.
Vatican II, passed by a vote of 2221 to 88 of the assembled bishops. This declaration was promulgated on October 28, 1965 by Pope Paul VI. True, the Jewish authorities and those who followed their lead pressed for the death of Christ. Still, what happened in his passion cannot be charged against all...
In this case, passion is the word for the death and resurrection of Jesus. Sorry to interrupt you, Neil.
What happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews, without distinction, then alive, nor against the Jews of today. The Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God, as if this followed from the Holy Scriptures. All should see to it, then, that in catechetical
Easy for you to say. Catechetical
work, or in the preaching of the Word of God, they do not teach anything that does not conform to the truth of the gospel and the Spirit of Christ. Furthermore, in her rejection of every persecution against any man, the Church, mindful of the patrimony she shares with the Jews, and moved not by political reasons, but by the gospel's spiritual love, decries hatred, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at any time and by anyone.
What does that mean in English?
We're off the hook.
We're off the hook. It's a revolutionary
It's a step.
Statement. It's a leap, right? It's a leap.
Wouldn't that be collective punishment? In a sense.
The way the Christians looked at the Jews for call it 1900 years was collective punishment against us. Right? So what does the Vatican come here in 1965 and say? Right? We no longer accept collective punishment. The Vatican here says you can only blame the Jews who were living at the time who persecuted Jesus. Right? They even come to say, forget about the Jews who lived in 1965. They're also letting off the hook the Jews who lived when Jesus was alive but weren't part of turning him in. Right? It's a major statement. Revolutionizes Catholic-Jewish relations. Good for them. Right? They're letting the Jews off the hook, as it were. What else is significant about this?
And make sure you don't teach it.
And don't teach it. Right? The Jews are siblings. Right? Mindful of the patrimony she shares. Right? This is a major revolutionary statement. Why did it happen? Carol, were you going to ask a question before I ask
I
one?
was going to say that the damage is done, and if you ask the Christian world, they still believe that we killed Jesus.
There are elements of the Christian world that blames Jews for killing Jesus.
Yes.
The Catholics, as an official doctrine, don't blame you and me, though. Right?
There's no one in the Protestant sect that's come out with such a statement.
There have been, yes. Vatican II, was the forerunner of it. The Protestants, especially Martin Luther, who was the leader of the Protestant Reformation, was no friend of the Jews. So it's not a surprise that it took Protestants a little longer. But yes, there are Protestants who don't blame Jews for the death of Jesus. I should say it. There are Protestants who don't blame you and me for the death of Jesus.
What about that whole evangelical sect that seems to be so pro-Israel?
Right. Well, there are two different layers to that. Some of them, maybe even most of them, don't blame you and me. They also believe that they need Israel in order for Jesus to come back. They need the Jews in Israel for Jesus to come back.
They're apocalypse.
Apocalyptical, right? Which is why
which we get the bad end on that.
Which is why it's so important to those Christians to support a Jewish Israel, because they need a Jewish Israel for Jesus to come back. That's their motivation.
That's their motivation. And Begin said, "Come on in."
So why? So this great. So yay, Vatican II, right? We're all in favor of Vatican II. Why did it happen?
State of Israel, the Holocaust and the state of Israel.
The Holocaust primarily, and then the state of Israel a little bit, but the Holocaust primarily.
But it was 20 years after.
It was 20 years after, but historians suggest people weren't ready to come to grips with the Holocaust until at least the 50s.
Wasn't John very influential in his preaching to soften up relationships? I always felt he was the one that was instrumental.
John 23rd started it.
For sure, right? And ultimately, it's to me, this is the Catholics acknowledging their role in not stopping the Holocaust. Right? That's a part of this, right? Without taking blame for it, they're acknowledging it through this document.
John was before Paul.
Yes.
That John was before Paul.
Yes.
The heavyset guy.
John was after Paul.
Well, there's John Paul who came after Paul. Right?
John
So,
23.
John 23rd started it.
Yeah.
He was the good one.
So is his blood on our hands? We Jews say no. Period. End of story. His blood is on Roman hands. That's my perspective as a rabbi. His blood is on Roman hands. From the Catholic perspective, as one branch of Christianity, Jesus' blood may have been on the hands of those Jews who lived at the time and were part of the people who turned him in. But Jesus' blood is not on everyone's hands. Certainly not on the hands of Jews living today. Okay. That's the answer to the first question. Everyone with me on that? Okay.
Question. When you say that they need a Jewish Israel for Jesus to come back, they, Christians in general.
Correct. Christian theology.
Okay.
Suddenly then, there's a relationship between Joseph and the Immaculate Mary. The Immaculate Birth.
Right. What do you mean that there's suddenly a connection?
Well, we know.
Yeah.
Well, we don't know. We presume that Mary and Jesus had a relationship. But in the very first class, we were rejecting the
virgin
lineage.
birth.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So when it comes now to the question of why did or do the Jews reject Jesus, right? I prepared for everybody at the bottom of page 24 there a handy-dandy checklist. If anybody ever comes to you claiming to be the Messiah, all you have to do is take out this checklist from your rabbi, and you can find out whether or not this person is actually the Messiah. Right? That's right. You can laminate it and keep it in your wallet if you like. So as we look at this checklist and apply it to what we know about Jesus, let's see how we do. Did the suggested, and these are based on Hebrew biblical as well as rabbinic explanations of our understanding of the Messiah. Right? And Helen, this will come to your point. Did the suggested Messiah restore traditional observance of Judaism? I think it's pretty safe to say that Jesus did not accomplish that. Okay. Did the suggested Messiah establish Jewish sovereignty over the promised land of Israel? I think it's pretty safe to say that Jesus didn't accomplish that. Did the suggested Messiah rebuild the Holy Temple? Is the suggested Messiah a descendant of King David on his father's side? This is why the virgin birth becomes such a complicated issue for the Jews.
I thought on one of the booklet, or one of the things, they list out the names. Well, I don't know if it's true or not, but
as we looked a week ago or 2 weeks ago, you weren't here for that. We traced the lineage as the Gospels give it to us from Abraham, actually from Adam even, all the way to Jesus through King David. Okay. Right? We know the Messiah being a descendant of King David.
And did it work?
Well, their math worked until one, you started comparing one gospel writer to another who give us different names in that lineage. And then two, it's got to be a patrilineal descendant of King David. So either Joseph is Jesus' father or he's not. If Joseph is Jesus' biological father, and you buy the fact that Joseph is a descendant of King David, then you're good to go with Jesus being a descendant of King David. But if you buy the virgin birth, then Joseph is not the biological father, and thus Jesus can't be a descendant of King David. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Christian theology says you can. We reject it, as did our ancestors. Right? If it's a virgin birth, he's not a descendant of King David on his dad's side, because he didn't have a dad. If it's not a virgin birth, fine, we'll accept that he's, a descendant of King David. Maybe he fits one of these characteristics, but then get rid of your virgin birth story. We're not going to buy it. Right? You can't have both.
Will that ever come to pass?
Will whatever come to pass?
Will that ever come to pass?
Get rid of the virgin birth story?
We've had the disciple from Paul VI. Will there ever come a time when they deny the
virgin birth? They're not asking my opinion.
Where did this checklist come from? The Torah? Particularly the first one, that we should restore traditional observance. Does that mean sacrifices and so forth? And how does that fit in with the theology of rabbinic Judaism as we've evolved to today?
It's a great question. There's what I call machlok. There's an argument about that.
Could you repeat it?
So the question is, if the Messiah restores us to traditional Judaism, what does traditional Judaism look like? And who's defining it? The majority of Orthodox thinkers, I think it's safe to say, would suggest the existence of a holy temple, sacrifices being brought at the holy temple, and Jews observing the 613 commandments. Okay? The existence of a holy temple, the sacrificial cult reinstituted at the holy temple, and full observance of the 613 commandments. Which, by the way, Jesus rejects the whole idea of commandments, but we'll put that aside for now. Maimonides, however, as a minority opinion, but not a small minority opinion, Maimonides, right? He came to say that he thinks that sacrifices are an ancient way of observing, of relating to God that was good for the ancients, but isn't good for us today. Maimonides taught prayer will be a permanent replacement to sacrifice. And that when the third Holy Temple comes, prayer will take place there, not sacrifice. But Maimonides is by and large a minority opinion in that. So you actually have Kohanim living in Israel who are training so that the moment the Holy Temple falls from heaven, and crushes the dome of the rock, as it were, they'll go right into business with the sacrifices. And they're even, if you've gone to the Cardo in Jerusalem, you can see they've got the menorah. They're putting the accoutrements in place so that when the temple comes to be again, we're right back in business.
And Peter doesn't want it either. Peter doesn't want it either, the sacrifices.
There are a lot of people who don't want that. All right. So another question, has resurrection of the dead occurred for the entire Jewish people? We know this is essential theology of Judaism. And finally, did the suggested Messiah bring peace to the world? I don't know if you've read the New York Times or Wall Street Journal lately. Doesn't strike me as peace coming to the world.
Is Elijah supposed to bring in the prophet too?
And Elijah heralds in the prophet.
Okay.
Right. So that is your handy-dandy checklist for why the Jews reject Jesus. And if you come now to page 25, I brought some highlights of that. And really when it comes down to if you should ever engage in a conversation with Christians about why the Jews reject Jesus, more often than not they're going to bring 35 different quotations from the Hebrew Bible as to why Jesus is a fulfillment of the Jewish prophecies. And you should know that it's pretty convenient that every single prophecy gets fulfilled. Because this, I think, Jim, comes back to the part of the question I didn't really answer, which is how do we know what the Messiah looks like and what the Messianic era looks like? By and large, it comes from the Hebrew Bible, primarily the prophets, the prophetic writings, Isaiah and Jeremiah most specifically, Ezekiel as well, but all of the prophets, and then from rabbinic literature following therefrom. All right, so when we come into now the problematic theology, why Christianity is so different from Judaism, and why what Jesus preached is problematic for the Jews, it ultimately comes to answer the question why we rejected him. Or maybe more to the point, why our ancestors rejected him, and we continue to see the rejection of Jesus as sound logic. All right, so the first one we spoke about briefly, which was the virgin birth. We know Isaiah chapter 7 says, Then Isaiah said, Hear now, you house of David, is it not enough to try the patience of humans? Will you try the patience of my God also? Isaiah continues, Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The Alma will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. Okay? Alma is a Hebrew word, which means primarily young woman. But it could be a young woman of birthing age. Right? The Hebrew does not imply virgin. However, the Greek translation, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of Isaiah translates the Hebrew Alma into the Greek for virgin. And then the Christian foundational writings, those authors, the early Christians, were reading the Greek, not the Hebrew. Okay? That's where the virgin birth story comes from. Their understanding of the Hebrew Bible as translated into Greek. Everyone with me so far on the virgin birth? Our understanding is you can't both have a virgin birth and be a descendant of King David on the father's side. You can't have both.
Even if you're devout, religious, and everything, how can they really think there's a virgin birth? And they want to think that.
Do you really believe that Moses parted the Red Sea? At the end of the day, it's the F word I use most often. Right? What's the F word I use most often? Faith.
Oh, no. Now you ate me.
That can come up and part the sea.
What did you just say?
Scientifically, it's possible.
Okay, then I have a bridge to sell you as well.
Show me.
You know, right. At the end of the day, it's a miracle, and either you believe it or you don't.
Why couldn't Alma mean that she was a virgin before she she was a virgin?
That's another explanation. She was a virgin until she conceived. Right. And then, as science or math would prove it, she was no longer a virgin at that point. Right. It could very well be. Judy?
Reading the cases of rape, the current cases of rape, it occurred to me when this discussion came about the virgin birth that she could have had a drug and simply not remembered.
Or maybe it was an illicit affair that she didn't tell anybody about. Right? There could be all of those explanations. And that's exactly right. And when we read the Gospels last week, right, Joseph seemed to pretty much accept that. That she did something happened to her, right? Whether you want to blame her or not, that she probably wasn't a virgin when she came to the marriage. What? Could be. Could be. All right. So that's one of the reasons that we reject Jesus as Messiah, Son of God, etc., is because we don't accept this virgin birth story and the idea of Jesus being a descendant of King David. Ruth, were you going to ask something? Oh, I thought you had your... Okay. All right. 2. Jesus as Son of God or replacement theology. In Hebrew, what do they call the New Testament? Anyone know? If you go to Israel and you want to talk about the New Testament, the Christian foundational writings, what do they call it? The Brit Chadashah. The New Covenant. Because ultimately the New Testament means the New Covenant. And part of Christian theology is the idea that because the Jews didn't accept Jesus, didn't follow what God wanted, boom, the Jews are no longer subject to the Brit, the covenant that existed between God and Abraham. There's now a New Testament, a new covenant, a Brit Chadashah, the followers of Jesus. And because ultimately, Christians believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Christians believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Okay? Jews agree. Jesus is the Son of God. But so am I. So are you. You're the daughter of God, right? All of us are the children of God. Right? When we come and take a look at Exodus chapter 21, and I'm still on page 25 here. The Lord said to Moses, "When you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go." Everyone with me so far? We've probably heard this story once or twice. "Then you, Moses," God says, "shall say to Pharaoh, 'Thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, let my son go that he may serve me. But you've refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn.'" This is why God goes after the firstborn of the Egyptians. Because the Egyptians went after the firstborn of God. Who's the firstborn of God? The Jews, the people of Israel. But the Christians believe that the Jews are no longer subject to the commandment. But they have a problem because if the Jews are God's chosen people, so they create what's called this replacement theology. That nope, the Jews, you failed, we're kicking you out. Christians are now the rightful heirs of the covenant. Can anyone tell me where in the prophetic literature it says, if the Jews don't continue to observe the covenant, God will disown them? It doesn't say it. Rather, the prophetic literature actually comes to say, I know you're going to break the covenant, but I will be forever faithful to you. Okay? Replacement theology actually goes against the scriptures.
If the Christians consider themselves the recipients of the covenant, why don't they circumcise their sons?
Because Paul said that you don't have to follow the Jewish law.
That's exactly right.
But that's part of the covenant.
That was a sign of the covenant, but ultimately, really, primarily through Paul, Christianity comes to reject our entire notion of commandments. Hosea, you see,
who came up with 613? Who was the editor of all of it? That's a lot of commandments.
Yeah, who was the first one to come up with the counting? It's early. It goes back a ways.
Who made them all up? That's a lot.
I don't know who made them up, but it's a question of how they got counted to 613.
I think it comes from Deuteronomy, I think, but what I was told is most of them they're priestly and they're agriculture and they're food, so
Right.
it really comes down to only 24.
There's a lot more than 24, but you and I can't observe 613 commandments because a good bulk of them require the Holy Temple to be in existence. Right.
And Israel.
Right. All right. Hosea says, when Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Who are they referring to here? Israel. Right? The more they called him, the more they went from them. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning incense to idols, regardless. God calls the Jewish people his son. Right? Child, however you want to degenderize the term. Not an individual man. The Jewish people. Okay? So do we accept the idea that Jesus was the Son of God? Sure, why not? So am I. Right? Jesus was a Jew, I'm a Jew. Right? We're both the sons of God. But we don't accept the idea that Jesus and his followers are now the rightful heirs to the covenant between God and Abraham. The rightful heirs to the covenant between God and Abraham remain the Jews because God promised that he would always be faithful to us, even though we're not always faithful to him. Okay. Number 3, Jesus' rejection of Jewish law. Matthew chapter 15. After Jesus called the crowd to him, he said to them, Jesus said to the crowd, hear and understand. It is not what enters into the mouth that defiles the man, but what proceeds out of the mouth. This defiles the man. What does that mean in English?
You don't have to keep kosher.
Okay. Now, he's not wrong that what comes out of the mouth defiles the man. That part is true, and we agree. But we Jews will tell you, at least conservative and observant Jews, what goes into the mouth matters too. Right? Do you want to ask something, Judy?
No.
Oh, okay.
No,
So Jesus, right here, rejects the system of kashrut. And Paul, as Jesus' sort of lead follower who goes off to preach the gospel, as it were, though he preceded the gospels, Paul comes to reject the entire system of commandments. And says, as long as you believe in Jesus, you don't have to fulfill the commandments. And guess what? In a world where the commandments are hard to fulfill, you and I struggle to fulfill them. Boy, that sounds pretty nice.
A free ride.
Right? It's a free ride. All you have to do is believe. You don't need 2 sets of dishes. You don't have to circumcise your kids. Right? You mean not turn a cell phone on Shabbos? Right? Forget it all. All you have to do is believe. And you'll be okay.
What about the 10 Commandments?
They keep an affiliation with the 10 Commandments. That's pretty much their bylaws. Right? But that's it.
In terms of problems, it seems to me that we're ignoring the elephant in the room, and that is that Jesus is a literary character, not a real person. There was no real person as described in the Gospels who lived at the time. And so we can analyze the Gospels, we can analyze the Christian writings, but that's all it is.
And at the end of the day, I agree with you. I do.
But we could say the same thing about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
That's why it's a problematic argument.
No, it's not a problematic argument. Because we don't worship Abraham and Moses as the Son of God. We worship them, or we consider that they are great characters because of their theology, because of their philosophy, not because of their personhood.
So we respect them, but we don't revere them.
In the anthropology, is there anything written on Jesus at 2,000 years ago? Because I know there's nothing written on Moses or
the only thing contemporary to that time period really comes from Josephus.
Okay. Yeah.
Jesus is mentioned in Josephus's writings, but there's a challenge to whether those pieces are actually authentic to Josephus or insertions after the fact in order to justify it.
But there's lots of indirect evidence that such a person never lived, despite Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and a few others who mention their writing.
You'll never convince Mel Gibson.
Josephus was a Jew, but didn't he go over to the Roman side and become very pro-Roman?
Yes.
So can we trust what he is writing regarding the Jews of his day? Is he trying to please the Romans?
It's a fair question. You have to take it with a grain of salt. All right, I want to just plow through. We only have a few minutes left here. So among the reasons why we Jews reject Jesus is because Christianity, I won't say Jesus, I'll say Christianity, primarily from Paul thereafter, rejects the system of commandments. There's nothing in Hebrew literature that says the Messiah will reject the system of mitzvot, of commandments. In fact, just the opposite. Right? We believe that the Messiah will actually restore Jews to proper worship. If you see a guy, pardon the gender specificity, if you see a guy riding into town on a white donkey, and all of a sudden you pick up your newspaper and it says world peace, it's time to start observing the mitzvot. I'll just put it out there. Right? But this Messiah will bring that to be. Okay. So I'm going to continue with Matthew's writings here. So first, Matthew quotes Jesus. It's not what enters into the mouth that defiles the man, what proceeds out. Verse 12, then the disciples of Jesus came and said to him, do you know that the Pharisees, right, the early rabbis, were offended when they heard this statement? Well, yeah. Right? But Jesus answered and said, every plant which my heavenly Father did not plant shall be uprooted. Let them alone. They are the blind guides of the blind. And if a blind man guides a blind man, both will fall into a pit. What is Jesus saying about the rabbis?
They don't know what they're talking about.
They don't know what they're talking about. Big shock that he was not beloved among the rabbinic community. All right. Any questions, comments about that? So those are three basic rejections of why the Jews did and continue to reject Jesus. Right? Jesus doesn't fit our Messiah checklist. And I'll point out, we're not going to read them right now, but hopefully everybody took the handout that says at the top, Neutralizing Missionary Encroachment. It comes from this book, Modern Jews Engage the New Testament. But it's essentially a quick, handy-dandy guide to why Jews reject Christian theology. Okay, so you can peruse that on your own in your free time. If you'll turn with me, though, now to page 26. Maimonides was a 12th century, born in Spain, moves to Egypt, leader of the Jewish world community really at the time, but primarily the Sephardic community. He lives in Egypt, he's a rabbi, he's a doctor, a leading thinker even today among Jews. Right? Maimonides writes a letter to Rabbi Yaakov ben Natan al-Fayumi, the head of the Yemen Jewish community in 1172. Okay? So this document is now 1,000 years old and some change. And let's hear now his perspective already on Christianity from 1,000 years ago. Would someone mind reading page 26? Thanks.
Ever since the time of revelation, every despot or slave that has attained to power, be he violent or ignoble, has made it his first aim and his final purpose to destroy our law and to vitiate our religion by means of the sword, by violence, or by brute force, such as Amalek, Sisera, Sennacherib, Nebuchadnezzar, Titus, Hadrian. May their bones be ground to dust, and others like them. This is one of the two classes which attempt to foil the divine will.
All right, so this is Jewish theology. Ever since God chose the Jewish people and gave them the Torah, the world has been against the Jews. Right? The world has been against the Jews. And he says this is one of the two classes which attempt to foil the divine will, right? Which are those who do so by brute force. Physically trying to kill, destroy the Jews. The Iranians, for example. Okay? Hadrian, Titus, the Romans, the Greeks, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, Sennacherib, the Assyrians, Sisera and Amalek before them, the ancient tribes. Okay? There have always been, since God gave us the Torah, people who were jealous and sought to destroy us by physically killing us. Will you take the next paragraph?
Sure. The second class consists of the most intelligent and educated among the nations, such as the Syrians, Persians, and Greeks. These also endeavor to demolish our law and to vitiate it by means of argument, which they invent, and by means of controversies, which they institute. After that, there arose a new sect which combined the two methods, namely conquest and controversy, into one, because it believed that this procedure would be more effective in wiping out every trace of the Jewish nation and religion. It therefore resolved to lay claim to prophecy and to found a new faith, contrary to our divine religion, and to contend that it was equally God-given. Thereby it hoped to raise doubts and to create confusion, since one is opposed to the other, and both supposedly emanate from a divine source, which would lead to the destruction of both religions. For such is the remarkable plan contrived by a man who is envious and querulous. He will strive to kill his enemy and to save his own life. But when he finds it impossible to attain his objective, he will devise a scheme whereby they both will be slain.
Okay, harsh words. Maimonides is writing pretty strong here.
Does he refer to Christians or Muslims?
Great question. Let's continue. Mel, do you mind picking up?
Sure. The first one to have adopted this plan was Jesus the Nazarene. May his bones be ground to dust. He was a Jew because his mother was a Jewess, although his father was a Gentile. For in accordance with the principles of our law, a child born of a Jewess and a Gentile, or of a Jewess and a slave, is legitimate. Jesus is only figuratively termed an illegitimate child. He impelled people to believe that he was a prophet sent by God to clarify the perplexities in the Torah, and that he was a Messiah that was predicted by each and every seer. He interpreted the Torah and its precepts in such a fashion as to lead to their total annulment, and the abolition of all of its commandments and the violation of its prohibitions. The sages of blessed memory have become aware of his plans before his reputation spread among our people, meted out fitting punishment too. Daniel had already alluded to him when he presaged the downfall of a wicked one and a heretic among the Jews who would endeavor to destroy the law, claim prophecy for himself, make pretenses to miracles, and allege that he is the Messiah, as it is written. Also the children of the impudent among thy people shall make bold to claim prophecy, but they shall fail.
Oh, that's rough.
It's pretty strong. Maimonides is no big fan of the Christians. He did live primarily in a Muslim world. According to Maimonides, why did, do, and should the Jews continue to reject Jesus?
He encouraged them to break the laws.
He encouraged them to break the laws.
But he also accepts that the blood is on our hands.
And he has no problem with it, right? Yeah, he's actually quite proud of it, in fact. But at the end of the day, how can you have a Jewish Messiah who rejects the entire system of Judaism? It doesn't make sense, right? If you read your Hebrew Bible, if you understand even what predates Jesus historically, why would God send his son to reject and throw off all of the commandments that God had given us?
Rabbi, I saw one movie and he said just the opposite. He says he wasn't here to change the laws. That's the statement according to the movie.
Right. But to fulfill them is the next line. I'm not here to abrogate or throw off the yoke of the commandments. I'm here to fulfill them. Right?
So that he is the primary, ultimate sacrifice.
And when it comes to that idea, you know that Jesus' crucifixion took place around the time of Passover. So he's often called the Paschal offering. Now, what we didn't have time to get into, but it's fascinating, is to compare which day was Jesus actually crucified on. Did it actually take place on Passover? Would the Jews have ever condoned a crucifixion on a Yom Tov? Okay. And if not, how does that work into the whole theology of the matter? But the idea that a man could be the sacrifice for all of us is based in a lot of ways on the book of Isaiah. Isaiah calls the Jewish people the suffering servant. Okay? Isaiah calls the Jewish people the suffering servant. And Isaiah's explanation for why bad things happen to the chosen people, if you will, right, is because God chose us to be Or LaGoyim, a light unto the nations. And God knows that when bad things happen to us, we Jews end up going out and teaching the world. Right? Why is the world today so much against genocide? Because the Holocaust. Right? We took one for the team, as it were, to teach the world.
Armenians were first, though.
Yes. Well, depends how far back you want to go.
Okay.
The Armenian genocide preceded the Holocaust.
Yes.
But not necessarily other attempts to kill the Jews.
How many died in
a million.
Yeah, I think 1 million is the number I've heard.
How
A million. Right? Which is, I'm not proud of the fact that we lost more than they did. So Isaiah talks about this idea of the suffering servant, that the Jewish people are suffering in order to be Or LaGoyim, a light unto the nations. But Isaiah is not talking about a particular individual who can, by his death, release the Jews from their obligation to fulfill the commandments. And also, there's nothing in Hebrew Scripture that talks about a second coming. If you didn't get it the first time, you're not going to come back. You get a chance to come back and do it the second time. So all of these concepts are really foreign to Judaism, and especially when you start to add them all up, you'll see why the Jews rejected Jesus 2,000 years ago and why they continue to reject the Jews today. Any questions?
When Jesus say, "I'm the Messiah," it was his PR group that followed him.
Jesus gave hints that he accepted that idea.
Well, he said it.
But yes, by and large,
He didn't come out and say, "Here, guys."
that's right. By and large, you're right. It was his PR team. Eileen?
I'm confused. We don't believe in the second coming, but we believe in the Messiah.
Yes.
And the difference is, he's not been here before?
The Messiah will do it in his lifetime. He doesn't get a second chance. Right? If he didn't do it in his lifetime, he wasn't the Messiah.
But if we believe in resurrection,
Yes.
that's a second lifetime.
But that's not...
Yes, but it's separate from... They're not connected. They're not connected. All right, so with that, we remind ourselves as Jews, we fulfill the mitzvot. Go out and do a mitzvah today or this week. Thank you, everybody, for this wonderful learning opportunity. Thank you.
John Corker.
Stop there.